Good morning, West Jackson. How are you? Yeah, I know. This is the 9 o'clock service. My name is Dave Runyon. As Andy mentioned, I'm excited to come and share part of my story with you. I served as a pastor in the Denver metro area for a little over a decade. And during that time, I got obsessed with this one part of Scripture, and it changed the trajectory of my life. I was reading through the Gospel of John, came to chapter 17, and in that chapter, that entire chapter, is this prayer of Jesus that happens right before he's arrested. And he prays for himself, for what he's getting ready to go through. He prays for the disciples, and then he prays for all of us. He prays for every believer that was alive at that time and every believer to come. And so in this very crucial moment in his life, when he prays for us, he prays for oneness. Like, of all the things that he could have prayed for in that moment for us, he prays for unity. And he doesn't just pray for unity for the sake of unity. He prays for unity, and he says that when there's unity among us, among believers, that people that don't know God will be drawn towards him. And I remember reading that and thinking about all the things that I was up to. A lot of really good things that I was up to at the church, and I remember just thinking, like, how much of my time is being spent towards this, towards just really focusing on unity and oneness. And I wasn't just thinking about my church, I was starting to think about all of the other Bible-believing churches that were right around us. Not as many as there are in Tennessee, by the way, but in Denver there's far fewer, but there's still a lot. And so I started to have coffees and breakfasts and lunches with different faith leaders, and just to start talking about this. And what I learned is that this was something that was brewing in others. And so a group of my friends and I got together, and we started to dream and think and pray about what it would look like if you could mobilize the sleeping giant of volunteerism in just common good in our churches into our specific part of the Denver metro area. And as we started to do that, we realized we didn't know our city as well as we probably should. And so we started to have these community conversations, and we would throw faith leaders in the room, and then we would invite in different civic leaders. And about 11 years ago, I was sitting in this room with our mayor and with these different faith leaders, and we would always ask them the same things. We would say, tell us about your story. How did you end up in civic service? And we started to realize that a lot of these local government leaders had a calling just like we did. And then we would ask them, hey, if you could wave a magic wand and change something in our community, what would you change? What's the thing? If we were going to go after one thing, what should we go after together? And so our mayor pulled out this piece of paper. I told him what all the questions were before. That's how you get politicians to come into your meeting, so they're not terrified of whatever is going to happen. But he pulled out this piece of paper, and he said, I want to live in a city where there's no single moms living below the poverty line, where there's no at-risk kids, where there's no financial debt, where there's no elderly shut-ins. And he had this long list of things, and 11 or 12 different things that he kind of read off to us. And then he took this little piece of paper, he put it away, and very much in passing, he just said, if you guys wanted to do the thing that would impact our city the most, you should start some kind of a neighboring movement. And then he just kind of moves on. He starts and we're like, go back to that. And he just said, what we're learning at the city is that when people are connected in their neighborhoods, in their apartment complexes, in their rural areas, that it takes all this weight off the systems that we're trying to create for people in need. And we're just listening to him, and he said, we're learning that relationships trump programs. That's, by the way, that's a Jesus thought, right? Like relationships, people, connections between individuals are far more important than like these programs that we're trying to do. And he talked to us about this big program that they were going to develop for elderly, isolated elderly, and he just said, it's great. We're going to spend a couple $1 million. We're going to do this whole thing. But what we know is if that person who is growing older and more isolated and doesn't have family around, that if they're connected, if they're known by their neighbors, they never need the program that we're getting ready to develop. And now I just want you to put yourself in that room. We're a bunch of pastors who make our living like helping people to orient their lives and connect with God and around the teachings of God, right? And our mayor is sitting there saying, hey, pastors, you know what'd be great? Could you get your people to do like the most basic thing that the Bible says to do? And it was this incredibly convicting and sacred moment, hearing our government leader say, hey, that love your neighbor thing, you guys should do that. It would like turn our city upside down overnight. And I'll never forget driving home from that time, and my head, I had 1,000 thoughts going through my head. The two that I can remember right now, I just had this thought of, Jesus is smart. You think as like a pastor, I'd have that thought a lot, right? But it would just like dawn like, oh my goodness, is it possible when Jesus gets asked to boil the entire text down to one thing, when he says, love your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor? Is it possible that when Jesus is asked to boil the text down to one thing, that he gives us a simple strategic plan that if we did it, it would change the world overnight? That was my first thought. My second thought was that I realized I wasn't actually doing it. Like I was so busy doing all of these other things to kind of keep our church running and serving on different nonprofit boards and driving my kids around to different sports activities. Like I was so busy doing all of that stuff that I wasn't very engaged at all in my own neighborhood. And I remember I went into my house and I told my wife everything that had happened, and she just looked at me and said, what are you going to do about it? My wife was ahead of me on this neighboring thing, by the way. She's ahead of me on most things. But so I just remember, and I didn't want to like lock myself into anything like with accountability. And so I just kind of said, I'm just going to spend more time in the front yard for a year. And that simple, and I actually did. I actually just started to like leave my phone in the house and spend a little bit more time in the front yard. And that one thing, that one step started to transform my life. It started to opened up my world into this whole network, this whole little ecosystem of relationships that was there the whole time that I wasn't really paying attention to. And it was, for me, I grew up in the church, and I had drifted into a place where almost all of my relationships were other people who thought about the world the same way that I did. I had drifted into like a relational Christian bubble, and I was dying inside. There was a part of me that was just like, I love being around people that like don't yet know God. I love being able to share, the truth with them. And God just used this one little thing to open my world up. I'll come back and I'll tell you a little bit more about what that's looked like for my wife and I, but here's what happened with that group of pastors that was in the room. We were all sitting in the room, and we prayed after the mayor left, and we said, that's something that we need to pay attention to. Let's pray about this, and we'll all come back 2 months later. And we came back 2 months later. We invited in our assistant city manager, because I had been kind of going around bugging different city leaders about their hearts and what we should do as a group of churches. And so we bring in Vicky. She's our assistant city manager, and she comes in, and she's just drinking all the neighboring Kool-Aid. She's actually the one who had kind of like given the vision to our mayor, and she's talking about how when neighbors know the first names of their other neighbors, that the crime rate is 80% less, and that people live significantly longer, and that when there's a natural disaster, that your neighbors are almost always your first responders because the systems are overwhelmed. And she's just sharing one thing after another, and then we kind of have this little Q&A time, and one of the pastors asked a question, and she didn't mean this in a mean, awful way, but she just said, from the city's perspective, I want to get her quote right. Yeah, from the city's perspective, there isn't a noticeable difference in how Christians and non-Christians neighbor in our community. And I remember we heard her say that, and we started to kind of push back, and we're like, come on, and then we realized, no, she's right. Of course she's right. She knows the city's perspective, but she just said there's not a noticeable difference in how Christians and non-Christians neighbor in our community. And I have shared that quote with leaders from well over 500 different cities, and I've never once have I had a mayor or a city manager or a police chief come up to me and go, "Oh, Dave, no, in my city, the Christians are the best neighbors." And I think that's like worth giving us pause to think about, like how do we make sense of the fact that like core to who we are as believers, core to Jesus' teaching and instructions to us is that we should love God with everything we have and love our neighbors. And yet, in our country, in our culture, in our cities, the people who God has put in positions of authority can't see a noticeable difference in the way we and the rest of the world treat our actual neighbors. And I started to like wrestle with that. I started to think like, how is that possible? And you know how you like sometimes you ask a question and you start to get mad? I felt like that. I was kind of getting irritated. And then I started asking a different question. I started asking like, I wonder, how did I become a pastor who was not engaged in his own neighborhood? And as I started to ask that question, I started to become reflective. I started to be convicted. I started to reread passages in the Bible that I had given multiple sermons on, that I had read hundreds of times, and they just started to take on a new light. And so we're going to look at one of those passages today, and this is a story that you've heard a bunch more times. My prayer is that we'd see this with kind of fresh eyes. It's found in Luke 10. If you have a Bible, you can turn there. If you don't have a Bible, we'll have it up here on the screen. As I have shared my journey with groups like this and with others, like I've come to realize that many of us, especially those of us that have grown up in the church, have become inoculated to the Great Commandment. It's one of those things that we've heard over and over and over again, and that we've put on t-shirts and on bumper stickers, but somehow, at least for me, what happened is I figured out a way to distance myself from like doing it in a really concrete way. And so let's look at what Luke 10 says, verse 25. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "What is written in the law?" he replied. "How do you read it?" He answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." "You have answered correctly," Jesus replied. "Do this and you will live." Just think about how powerful that is. Just do this and you will live. But look at this phrase here in 29. This is the part that just came screaming off the page at me personally. It says, "But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, 'And who is my neighbor?'" But he wanted to justify himself. So he comes, he asks Jesus this really straightforward question. Jesus gets him to answer his own question. He does this a few times in the Gospels. And this guy gives the perfect textbook answer. It's really clear. And this guy's first thought is like, how do I get out of this? But he wanted to justify himself. And so fascinating how he tries to like find some wiggle room. He says, like Jesus' neighbor, but what does that really mean? Okay, he's going to play like the let's define the word game with Jesus. How do I find that loophole in actually doing what you just said? Like, could I maybe like define the word neighbor so that it like most easily fits into what I want it to? By the way, this is the key. You want to become a pastor who isn't actually engaged in his own neighborhood. Here's what you do. You just define the word neighbor in a really loose, kind of metaphorical way so that you don't feel convicted about actually living it out with the people who live right around you. That's what I did. I didn't do it consciously. I just kind of I'm like, well, I'm serving on that board and I'm at church. I'm a pastor. I'm kind of just loving my neighbor all the time. And my life's really busy. And I don't know, some of those people seem really scary. And so I think I'm just kind of killing it. Okay, that was like all the stuff that was going. Now, when you say that out loud, it sounds awful. But if you just kind of allow yourself to drift into it, it's really easy. And maybe you are like me. Maybe you have looked at this idea of loving your neighbor and you've never made it concrete. You've never actually said, what if I did that with the people right next door as well? And so what happened to me is, and I think what happens to a lot of us, is we take this incredibly powerful teaching and we make it so big and so vague that I ended up with a metaphoric love for my metaphoric neighbors. And metaphorically, I was just doing great. Then in real life, there's these people who are sleeping 30, 40, 50 feet away from me, and I didn't know their names. And what I've come to learn is that, I was just kind of like loving everybody, and what happens is if you love everybody, sometimes you end up loving no one, or very few. And so I had disconnected by using this kind of metaphoric theology. I had disconnected from what if when Jesus said to love our neighbor, what if we drew a circle around the places that he's put us and then began to work out from there? And it doesn't mean all of the other stuff that we're up to. That it doesn't invalidate that clearly. Those of you that serve here with kids or children or greeters, whatever it is, when you're building a relationship here at church with somebody who lives 12 miles away from you, clearly in Jesus' economy, that's loving your neighbor, because he goes on in this text to tell the story of the Good Samaritan. And he says, listen, whenever you care for the person in front of you, no matter where you are, no matter who it is, that is an act of loving your neighbor. When this guy says neighbor, what does that really mean? Jesus just he gives him the graduate level verse. He's like, okay, you want to play the let's define the neighbor game. He says, when you care for person, so when you're downtown at the rescue mission, when you're overseas on a global missions trip, no matter where you are, that is clearly loving your neighbor. But when Jesus talks about the Good Samaritan, he stretches the definition of neighbor for this person. When he gives him the graduate level version, he's assuming that this guy is loving the people of the same culture and customs, his actual neighbors, and he's giving them AP neighboring. And what I learned from my mayor is that that's great, that's really important, we want to hold all of that up, but that doesn't mean that Jesus wasn't talking about our actual neighbors. So what if when Jesus said that we should love our neighbors, what if he meant the people that live in our apartment complex, in our block, or wherever you live? Every one of you has neighbors. And that thought of maybe I should just go back to kindergarten instead of going straight to grad school has really been beneficial for me. And it started a movement in our city. And so in going back to kindergarten, we were able to take this teaching of Jesus that is so central to the entire text and to put it on the ground and to actually start living it out. Some of you were here last night with me. We did a cool little training, a lot of the community group leaders, and we did this little exercise. And this little exercise I'm going to do with you was the key to starting this movement in our city, to creating bridge builders who were believers all throughout our community who started to bring other people and be conveners together. And so if you have a piece of paper, I think you have this, I don't know if there's enough space for it, but if you have something in front of you to write on, just grab it, and I want you to just draw a tic-tac-toe board, okay? And if you don't have anything to write on, you can make it just look like this. If you don't have anything to write on, then you can just imagine this in your head. Just imagine this mentally, okay? So your house is in the middle. Those 8 other boxes are the houses that are closest to you, whether it's your hallway in a dorm or an apartment, whatever it is. Just think about the 8 closest units. Now, I just want you to take a minute. I want you to write down the names of the people, you can just do adults, that live in those 8 units right around you. So just take a second. Start writing down the names of the people. You can't cheat and ask your wife. Don't write guy that drives a blue car or annoying woman, okay? Real people's names. If you don't know the names, you can just leave them blank. And when I did this for the first time, it was a very humbling exercise. I started to realize, I know these people, I've met them, but there's some of them that weren't important enough for me to actually remember their names. And so in our city, in 26 different churches, we stood on the stages and we asked people to do what I'm doing right here. I said, would you just be willing, if you're a believer, would you be willing to make a commitment to learn and retain and use your neighbors' names? That's all we did. We didn't say, hey, become best friends with your neighbor. We didn't even say love your neighbor. Okay, we just said, would you just be willing to learn and retain and use the names of the people that live right around you? And what we learned is that like when I was growing up and like starting to like through college and starting to learn like what I want to do professionally, people told me, hey, if good leaders set the bar high. Good leaders, like if you're a good leader, you set the bar up here, and then people either come closer or come over, and that's probably true for like teams and things like that. But what we learned in our city is if you want to start a movement, the key isn't to set the bar high; it's to set the bar so low that people can't crawl underneath it. By the way, that's what we're doing right now. We're not asking you to love your neighbor. We're just asking you to like, would you just be willing to put this up on your fridge and to draw a tic-tac? My wife and I just had this. It was a tic-tac-toe board on a napkin, and I'm sitting there, and by the way, I could fill in like both adults' names in 2 of the 8 houses. My wife could fill in way more, but she's mean, and she made me do it. She's like, no, you're going to have to do this. You don't know their names. And so I'm just sitting there, and that little thing on my refrigerator started to haunt me. And I started to go, you know what, I'm going to do something about this. And I just started to look for small ways to connect with the people that were living right around me. And it was a series of mildly awkward conversations. I remember right after all this happened with the mayor, and I've got this napkin sitting on my fridge, and I walked out the front door, and my neighbor up and over was mowing his lawn. And I remember kind of walking out, I'm like, oh, that's one of the people whose names I've forgotten. And I thought I should go do something. And before I even took a step, I thought, oh, that's going to be so weird. Like he's in the middle of mowing his lawn. And I thought to myself, I'll just make up something to do in my front yard, and then when he gets done, I'm like, that's more weird. And then I actually thought to myself, I'll just go back inside, and I bet when I come out, and I caught myself there, I'm like, oh, I'm doing it. I'm finding the loophole right now. And so I remember like taking that first step and walking down my driveway and over, and he's mowing his lawn, and he's kind of like looking at me, just calmly walking over there, and he shuts off the lawnmower, and I go, hey, man. My other neighbor was Bro. I kept them totally separate. I thought that was really big of me. And I was like, this is really embarrassing. I know I've lived next to you for over 2 years now. I know we've met 3 times, but I forgot your name. And I said, I'm Dave. He said something horrible. He goes, I know. And so we shake hands. And it was this he's like, I'm Matt. My wife's Jan. It was this really quick interaction. And he was gracious, and I walked back inside, and I did something incredibly important. Anybody know what it is? I wrote it down. And after about 6 weeks, that whole little map that you're looking at, that you have some of those blank squares, I had them all filled in. And some of those neighbors, they just kind of stayed there. Stayed with like, oh, we know each other's names, and we use each other's names. And then some of those neighbors, as I just started to lean in towards them, the kingdom started to break out, and it went from like, hey, man, to hey, Matt, to hey, Matt, like, did you see the end of that Broncos game? To hey, I just need to move this thing in my garage like 30 feet. Could you help me? To hey, like, you guys are gonna be watching the game, and we're gonna be watching the game. Like, why don't we just do that together? To sitting across a dining room table and sharing our stories and our hearts and our beliefs with one another. And that wasn't an overnight deal. That was 2 years. This thing that like I had dreamed about as a pastor when I was setting up different outreach events, like I'm just sitting there across this table going, oh my goodness, it was here the whole time. And none of that happens if you don't lean in and have a mildly awkward conversation and learn their name. Like none of that, and there's something that's just so powerful. You learn somebody's name and something just starts to shift inside of you. Something starts to shift in the dynamic and in the relationship. And I just want to encourage you today, like, if you only get one thing out of our time here today, like, would you just be willing as a believer to go and just to start doing some small things out in your front yard or out in your apartment courtyard or wherever it is, that just might make a huge, huge difference. You know, so much of this is just like taking Jesus seriously about what he said and then actually acting on it and just starting to like take that next step and then the next step after that. And I would just encourage you that we talked about this last night. Look for places where people lean back towards you. So like I used to stalk my neighbors who didn't seem very interested. Don't do that. That's not a very good use of your time. And again, I just want to say this. It doesn't mean all the other great stuff you're doing, the parents on your kids' sports team or grandkids' sports team that you're building a relationship, that's loving your neighbor. I want to just continue to like validate that and lift that up. But to also then, in what I love about this church and about Rob and Andy, so many different people is like they bleed this. Like they believe in this as well. And so I want to encourage you to continue to do the things that you're involved in, if that's what God is calling you to, especially if it's building relationships and loving your neighbor. But to also think like, what does God want me to do? Like what we do in our front yards is real ministry. It's just as important of kingdom work as volunteering here or being involved here or serving there. And I think just being able to validate that and lift that up, I've seen over and over and over again in churches, like incredible things happen just by being able to lift that up. I love this passage in Acts 17. Paul is sitting on this little hill up above Athens, and their people are agitated with him, and then somebody says, tell us about your God, this God that you believe in, and he just unloads with like one of the great sermons on the character and the nature of God in the Bible. And in this sermon about God, he says this in Acts 17. He says, from one man he made every nation of men that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he determined the time set for them in the exact places where they should live. God did this so that men would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. He determined the time set for them in the exact places where they... What this says is you don't live where you live for the reasons you think you do. It's not because of the school district that you always wanted. It's not because it's the only thing you can afford. It's not because of the curb appeal or any of that you always wanted to have 4 bedrooms up. Okay, you live where you live because God has placed you there, and he's placed the people around you there as well. So that, and I love the posture that's described in this, so that when people seek him and reach out for him and find him, like so that they'll have your neighbors will have handles to grab onto when they reach out for God. This passage, this Acts 17 scripture changed the way I drove in and out of my neighborhood. I started to drive into my neighborhood realizing, like if you believe this, it'll change the way you view it too. You'll start to realize there's something sacred going on about my neighborhood. Like this is something that God has like placed me into for a reason. And so if you let that sink in, it will ruin you in a really good way. And the more you lean into this idea, the better it gets. And for my wife and I, it didn't just change our neighborhood. It has in so many amazing ways, but it's also changed us. And it's changed our kids. And I just want to tell you, it's super messy. Like hanging out with people and building relationships with people who don't think about the world the way that you do is really, really messy. And it's exactly where God wants us to be. And it's hard. It's like, and it's also just so profound and beautiful. And to walk with people. And so for me, as a person who was just walking, like finding myself in this kind of Christian bubble, hanging out with my church staff, doing retreat, all of that stuff, for me, it's been this incredible place of renewal and personal challenge. To go and to be a part of this little world. And we're 11 years in on this journey, and we live in this little loop of 40 homes, and we know each other. Like 20 of those households like know each other deeply, and we spend a lot of time together, and we have little text threads, and we have all of that stuff, right? And it starts here. It starts with the block map, with the little simple thing. And by the way, this is a little refrigerator magnet. I didn't do a great job of getting them here on time. So next week, as you leave, hopefully these will be sitting out there. But you don't need to have a little glossy magnet. You can just have a piece of paper. And you can get started today when you go home. If you're willing to lean in, if you're willing to just say, hey, I know I've met you multiple times before, or maybe you've never met him, and just say, hey, I know we've never met, and just to introduce yourself, and then to just start praying this dangerous prayer, which is, God, what's the next small step you want me to take with one of my neighbors? What's the next small step? I've just found that, like, building that into a rhythm in my life has prompted me and given me concrete ideas. I've just constantly said, God, what's the next small step you want me to take with one neighbor? And if I'll just sit, and in fact, we can just do this right now. Like, I just, take a moment, just reflect on this for a couple seconds. Like, God, what's the next small step you want me to take with one of my neighbors? As I just thought about that, one of my neighbors invited me to do this, one of those warrior runs or mud run. I'm not a big runner. I don't know if you can tell that from looking at me, but I'm not. I said, hey, I can't do it. And that was all. I didn't even follow up. And I just felt like this, maybe I should actually go follow up and thank him for inviting me to that and explaining why I wasn't able to, instead of just giving this little throw line. And for you, I don't know what it is for you. What's the next small step? I hope that God starts to give you thoughts and ideas about a person, about a really specific person you live next to, and that he might open up a door for you to take that step. And here's, for me, where it gets really interesting. So if just the people that call West Jackson home, if just the people there's about 500 households that call this place home. Okay, so if just this one church here in Jackson said, you know what, we're going to do this. Every one of you said you're going to do this. That means you touch over 4,000 households in the community, and let's just do the low math, and let's say there's 3 people in each of those households. That means 12, this church, this group of people that we're looking at here, could touch 12,000 individuals in this city, in this community. A buddy of mine said this. He said, in this life, we can only do a few things really well. I think we would be wise to make sure that one of them is the thing that Jesus said matters most. And so as we close this portion of our time, and I'm excited to be able to share with you again at 10:30, my prayer would just be that. Would you just, this would be a place, this would be a congregation that begins to just live this out, that begins to do some small things with the people that live right around them, that the ripple effect ends up making a huge, huge difference. Would you pray with me?